Good morning to all. Let us begin with today's keynote sessions. To begin with, I would call upon Professor Gaurav Raheja to introduce our keynote speakers for today.
Very warm good morning, one and all. I believe we came as strangers, but by now we are a society already. And to talk about society, who other than a sociologist could have a better command? Hence, the floor is going to be with three stars of the day who all fall in line from the global north to the global south, forming a beautiful triangle between Germany, Brazil, and Botswana. So, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, let's give with a round of applause a warm welcome to the three keynote speakers of today, Professor Gabriel Faimu, Professor Nina Bauer, and Professor Priya Presi. It's an honor for me to stand here and introduce the three stars for the keynote today. And here we go. Professor Gabriel Faimu is an associate professor of sociology and the acting director of research and development at the University of Botswana. Over the years, he has been teaching the following courses at undergraduate and postgraduate levels, which include concepts and principles of social research, research methods in criminological research, research proposal writing, data analysis and report writing, advanced research methods in social sciences, and several others. He is one of the lead partners of the Global Center of Spatial Methods for Urban Sustainability, and he's also a visiting professor at the Botswana International University of Science and Technology in Botswana and an extraordinary researcher at the Northwest University in South Africa. A very warm welcome, Professor Gabriel. Professor Nina Bauer, I believe the most well-known face by now, is the chair for Methods of Social Research, W3, at the Department of Sociology at the Technische Universität Berlin, TU Berlin. And in this function, she has been teaching courses in qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods, as well as social science epistemology for more than 20 years. She is also the director of the Global Center of Spatial Methods for Urban Sustainability, that's the GCSMUS, and the past president of the Research Committee on Logic and Methodology in Sociology, that's the RC33 network. A board member of the Research Committee on Historical Sociology, that's the RC56, of the International Sociology Association, that's ISA, and a member of the Collaborative Research Center, Refiguration of Spaces, the SFP 1265. A very warm welcome, Professor Nina. Finally, Professor Priya Presi, who's a professor of sociology of the city, space, and everyday life at the Department of Sociology of the University of São Paulo, where she has also regularly taught methods and techniques of empirical research to bachelor students in the social sciences, which includes sociology, anthropology, and political science since 2008. He has been coordinating the Center for Studies and Research on the Sociology of Space and Time since 2018. She is also a lead partner and an action speaker of the Global Center of Spatial Methods for Urban Sustainability, part of our SMUS, particularly that she coordinates the SMUS Strategic Action 4, which promotes practical empirical projects that the spatial methods, that is social science and design-based methods sensitive to social and relational dimension of space, may offer to teams of academics and professional practitioners, from the NGOs and CBOs to local government agencies. She is actually a bridge between research and practice, who intends to practically cope with empirical issues related to the SDG Goal 11 and the UN Agenda 2030. In 2022, she coordinated the SMUS annual conference at the University of Sao Paulo. And also to add a new flavor to this, Professor Frya, as I know, is also a Humboldt Fellow. With that, ladies and gentlemen, let's have all the guest speakers on the stage with a round of applause. We shall speak about decolonizing social research methods.
Okay, thank you, Gaurav, for this excellent introduction to three of us. And again, thank you, Gaurav, Manis, and Prof, for the hard work you have put for organizing this beautiful conference together with the SMUS Indian team. And good morning to you all colleagues. This morning, Nina, Praya, and I, we are going to talk about decolonizing research practice. Before I do my part, I come from the eastern part of Indonesia. I was trained for so many years in the central part of Indonesia. Then I went to Botswana, getting engaged in many community development projects. From Botswana, I went to the UK to complete my studies. I got back to Botswana and I moved to academia. Then later on, get engaged with colleagues from Germany and from other parts of the world. I tell this story because the story is going to shape how I interrogate the question of decolonizing research methodology. And that will be a position I would like to take in the talk I'm going to present this morning before my colleagues, Professor Frese and Professor Bauer. For decolonial thinkers, research, and I believe we all accept this, cannot be separated from imperialism and colonialism. So therefore, Smith, and this is what she said, research is one of the dirtiest words in the indigenous world vocabulary. And in the same manner, Edward Said also said that through research, the other is approached systematically as a topic of learning, discovery, and practice. So these thinkers, they actually propose that power dynamics are embedded in research. Research becomes a systematic way of undressing other people, a systematic production of others, or a systematic practice of othering, dominating and restructuring. As a researcher coming from Botswana, the question I'm interested in would be, is research really a dirty word? If indeed it is, then what is next? What risks are we supposed to overcome as researchers in the process of decolonizing research practice? The current scholarship of decolonization, and I would like to categorize this in two categories. That is the ideological approach and the reconstructive approach. I would like to present just a few key propositions of the first category, that is ideological approach. And the first one, again, based on what I have presented so far, the idea is that colonial domination does not only shape and influence our ideas of race, class, gender, and culture, it also involves what Santos said, epistemicide, or the murder of knowledge, the killing of knowledge. In the same manner, Maldonado Torres argues that decolonizing research should involve dismantling of relations of power and conception of knowledge. Then our colleague, Ndlovu Gatseni, he also underlined the same proposition when he said decolonizing must include undoing its dirty history. My problem with this kind of approach, and before I mention that, I believe the success of ideological approach would be diagnosing the problem without solving the problem. And I say this because I believe the ideological approach is developed based on two basic assumptions. The first one, and I don't think I can accept this type of assumptions, the first one would be the dominant group or the dominant system of knowledge production can simply be persuaded through intellectual argument and moral appeal, which I believe we can. The second assumption, a new conception of knowledge can easily be developed in place of the dominant system of knowledge production. Let me move on to the second one, that is the reconstructive approach. One of the key propositions of this approach would be that decolonizing research involves acknowledgement that colonial history is not the only history that shapes the knowledge system. Other histories or historical processes also play a critical role in the production of knowledge. Or, as claimed by Ndlovu Gatseni again, he says, decolonizing research includes processes of rethinking thinking, unthinking, learning to unlearn in order to relearn. You know, I don't speak English, but this is actually quite complicated, what is present. Based on these two categories, I would like to propose the third one, and we can call that a dialogic approach of decolonization of research methodology. And in proposing this, I believe a number of scholars have also tried to use the argument of conversational or dialogical approach in unpacking the question of decolonizing research. One of the propositions for this would be decolonizing research is not about diminishing a certain mode of knowledge production or epistemological approach. It is about broadening the area of conversation or intercultural relations that allows for a cultural encounter and knowledge exchange. Or, as argued by sociologist Megji, decolonizing does not necessitate a dismantling of the Northern theory, but rather involves a horizontal, reflective, and conversational approach. Decolonial reflexivity refers to acknowledging the colonial epistemology that dominates the interpretation of knowledge systems and produces a structure of authority that governs our knowledge production, and at the same time setting a conversational arena for mutual exchanges among different epistemologies that reflect particularities or different approaches. In the context of what I have been talking so far for decolonial reflexivity, we can say that the idea is informed by three key principles that have been discussed by a number of decolonial thinkers. First one, ecologies of knowledge, pluriversality, and interculturality. I am going to talk about this briefly. The first one, introduced by Santos again, the phrase ecologies of knowledge refers to the recognition of different ways of knowing. Therefore, the idea signifies a vision of coexistence and cooperation of many worlds in a pluriverse. Decoloniality promotes pluriversality as a universal option, which means what should be universal is in fact pluriversal and not a single totality. And this is from Mignolo and Wolff. The third one, interculturality, again as suggested by Mignolo and Wolff, is about building new different societies with new structural ordering, socio-political and cultural transformation. The dialogic approach recognizes the differences among cultures and values the sense of interconnectedness. And this basic proposition draws on the idea of recognizing the existence of different cultures or worldviews that has long been advanced by multicultural theorists such as Charles Taylor, Stuart Hall, Wilhelm Lica, Tariq Modot, and many others. In sub-Saharan Africa, where I come from, this is summarized in the philosophy of Ubuntu, we call it Ubuntu or Boto, with the basic principle that I am because we are, which means my existence is defined by the presence of others. The absence of others assumes the absence of I. So in this context, the idea of incompleteness or conviviality provides a dialogic space as we continue becoming through crossroads encounter and conversation. I already mentioned that the dialogic decoloniality involves knowledge of the differences among cultures. This knowledge, however, does not require, and I would like to underline this knowledge, however, does not require a complete understanding of the differences, or as suggested by Gurevich, the ability to not understand rather than the ability to understand the other is posited as crucial to the dialogic process. The question would be, what does the ability to not understand really mean? As seen in the circle of understanding here, and I would like us to check this, generally when we consider the notion of understanding, we are normally limited to the move from A and B. That will be a move from the inability to understand to the ability to understand. In this context, we actually remove our inability to understand by seeking for knowledge or information that would equip us with the ability to understand by gathering different information and explanations. However, and I would like to underline this again, often it happens that when we are in B, we are actually in C. Why? Because here understanding becomes a shortcut to cover up our inability to understand by taking others and ourselves for granted. What happens now is that with the presence of C, another situation is actually created, and that is the ability to not understand in D. And the D position does not necessarily mean that the other cannot be explained. What is necessary here is that the otherness of the other is revealed and therefore liberates it from our interpretations or our own perspectives. What is needed is not additional information or explanations, but the willingness and the ability to familiarize oneself with the strangeness of the other. Drawing on the argument of my colleague in the University of Cape Town, Francis Nyamjo, one of the leading contemporary African scholars, I suggest that the first step in decolonizing research practice should be about asking the right questions. And this was raised in the keynote we had yesterday. Asking the right questions is about recognizing the embeddedness of social research in cultural values, as well as scientific histories that shape the culture. Christianity is the biggest religion in Botswana. Between 2014 and 2017, I studied different movements, or let's say new movements, in the context of Christianity in Botswana. When I developed the questionnaire for a study, I consulted many surveys, including international surveys. And in general, in the existing surveys, there is only one question. And the question is, which church or denomination do you belong to? Having known Botswana for many years, by the time when I designed the questionnaire, I believe that this type of question won't be able to get me the answer I need for the study. So therefore, instead of developing just one question, I actually developed three questions. And the first one was, what is your current church? Number two, and I think this is a good one. Number two, which church would you say you belong to? And number three, which church did you last attend? And these three questions gave us surprising results. Out of 661 participants, at least 3%, they mentioned that we belong to this church, but we go to the church. So we belong to this particular one. So in terms of self-identification, I identify with this one, however, I go to a different one. And in the same manner, quite interesting, more than 11% actually stated that last week I went to a completely different church. And when it comes to family problems, more than 37% actually claim that we normally consulted religious leaders from different denominations, which is quite high. So now, in the same context, communicating from the local reference is another key point in terms of decolonizing our research methodology. Or as argued by some colleagues, decolonizing research practice is not as much as about the method, but more about the spaces that enable the research process. And that through this research process, the identities of the researcher also become reshaped and transformed. So in this context, the dialogic nature of the decolonial reflexivity assumes participatory research methods, something that was discussed yesterday, that recognize local context and empower the dynamic relationship between the researcher and the researchee. Instead of the research, meaning the participants we are doing research on, we probably need to consider the use of researchee to signify the research subjects. And I just want to raise just a very simple example. For more than a decade, 3 colleagues in the University of Botswana, they have developed a project called Young Women's Leadership. And in this project, the researcher, developed an idea of exploring whether the physical campus offered young women space in which to control their own gender and sexual lives. The project initially involved 3 faculty members and 13 students only. But over the years, the number has fluctuated over 1,000 students. What I found interesting is that the project is designed in such a way that the faculty members and the students were researchers and participants of the study at the same time. And following the design, the project team developed activities to interrogate the I stories, self and campus mapping, and sexual voices. The project revealed amazing results as the whole research process was viewed as a self-empowerment process through intergenerational dialogue. When the first results of the study were published, the researchers observed that in their I stories, young women in the project testified to how the project became their bridging platform between their families that were silent on issues of sexuality and university spaces that are hypersexual yet oppressive to female students. So based on this, I believe the colonial reflexivity is banking on the relationship between the researcher and the researcher. It favors a participatory approach that allows the researcher to benefit directly from the project. So in this project, the researcher is now the researcher, and the researcher is the researcher. So to conclude, based on what I have proposed, I would say decolonizing research practice is not about getting rid of the existing methods, but it is about diversifying the existing methods we have in our research practice. Over to you, Freya.
Good morning, everyone. It's an enormous pleasure for me to be here and to share these reflections with my colleagues and friends, Nina and Gabriel. Indeed, what I would like to propose as an issue for us all regarding this overall issue of decolonizing research is, and I have to say, I think it's important to say that, like Gabriel introduced himself quickly in as it were geopolitical terms, I myself am a Brazilian. I was born and grew up in Brazil, but my grandparents were grandparents, and in part even great-grandparents, great-grandparents came from Germany at the beginning of the 20th century. And I grew up in Brazil in a bilingual way, German, Portuguese, and went to the German school there, but always in this very intense dialogue with Brazil, because I'd never been to Germany prior to my 20th year of existence in this world. So, and then since then, I've been having these dialogue, very strong dialogues, intense dialogues, not only with Germany, but with other European countries. So it's important for me to say that, because you see how I look like, and it may convey the impression that I'm German, and at the same time, and I don't feel German. And it's important to say that due to what I'm going to address here, and which has to do with the countries we come from the global south, and how much this decolonial, these decolonial discussions, they were going, they were led in our countries prior to these, to this decolonization debates. This is what I would like to address here, based on the case of Brazil. Yes. So I start with the theories of decolonization, which we know that stem from intellectuals who grew up in Latin America. Yes. So sociologist Aníbal Quijano, yeah, who grew up in Peru, philosopher Enrique Dussel, who grew up in Argentina and lives in Mexico, and semiologist Walter Mignolo, who was born in Argentina. And in Brazil, the insertion of the Brazilian social sciences in this decolonization debate, one has to say, is relatively recent. An exploratory research of mine in, for example, Web of Science, showed that actually in the Brazilian debate, in the Brazilian academy, in the social sciences, this kind of preoccupation with decolonizing, or decolonization, it stems from the last 10 years, and mainly in the fields of history, of geography, and of anthropology. And obviously, in my opinion, and I think this is it's an obvious. It's not only it's almost obvious to say that we cannot understand this increase in the last 10 years without considering the increase in the globalization of science, social scientific knowledge since the 2000s. The impact of this debate, indeed, which, as we saw in Gabriel's presentation, applies to Africa, very specifically to Africa. We had these debates about decolonization very strongly at the Botswana conference. And then my question, which is actually the question we are addressing in this keynote, is really experiences from Brazil. Now, which are the experiences from Brazil, or what does the history of the social sciences in Brazil disclose about the decolonization of research practice? And as to this question, I would like here to present you a twofold statement. First, that there is a long-standing methodological and indeed an epistemological tradition of research practice decolonization in Brazil. Yes. I imagine that this may be polemic, and I'm going to address why. We are going to see that. But what I'm saying is that perhaps in our global south, there are more examples of decolonizing ways of addressing research practice in this global context, but coming from the global south. And it was not considered to be decolonization as such. Yes, that's historically prior to the debate as such. And a second point, this tradition is historically prior exactly to the decolonization debate. So in order to address this question, I would like to point out some sociological and anthropological research strand in Brazil, which I considered would be a kind of forerunning decolonization research practice tradition from Brazil. And in order to do that, I would like to quickly, and it's also, I am also using this presentation here for you to get a little bit more acquainted with the University of São Paulo, which is one of the lead partners here of the SMUS. Actually, I'm considering, we have to consider that the University of São Paulo was founded in 1934, and it's the first scientifically multifaceted university in Brazil. So it's, whether you believe it or not, our oldest university, scientifically multifaceted. So in this, the concept we have in the West about university, the oldest university is the University of São Paulo from 1934. So we are not even talking about a 100-year-old history of the social sciences in Brazil. Prior to that, we had only one university in Rio de Janeiro in 1920, but this was a religiously very strongly marked university. So why have I pointed out these names here? Because actually it's interesting to take into consideration that the social sciences in Brazil at the University of São Paulo, they started with the so-called French mission of, they were brought, French professors were brought to Brazil, very early researchers. Professors is almost, it's hyperbolic to say that. Claude Lévi-Strauss, the anthropologist who later became a famous anthropologist, was 27 years old and was a philosophy teacher in France, in Paris, and came there to start founding the university. And a young historian called Fernand Braudel, who later became very prominent, who went there also in his 20s to found the University of São Paulo. And this, in this context, what we have, so what I would like to say is, obviously we have a kind, it's a presupposition of this reflection of mine here, these ponderings, is that we are in the realm of what we nowadays call methodological nationalism. So, but this was globally valid at all. So this came alongside with the social scientific belief in the worldwide spread of European modernity, which, by the way, was also a commonsensical way to relating to European North American values, conceptions, goods, and infrastructure. So this was the context. Yes, I'm not saying that this did not exist, that the overall comprehension about what the world was in the social sciences was really led by this idea of everything modernity comes from Europe and United States and so on. Yes, but amidst all of these very, we would say from our standpoint, impossible to have a decolonizing way of addressing sciences, I have to say that these guys, I'm actually pointing out specifically Claude Lévi-Strauss, who worked there for 2 years, and afterwards, very important for us, for our history, Roger Bastide, a sociologist, a French sociologist, both of them at Lévi-Strauss, a Jew, Roger Bastide, a Protestant, who came, and this is important to say, due to the religious configuration also of the university. So the university was a laic university, the first laic university in Brazil. And both of them, when they came, you see, if one is interested in that, just has to read Tris Tropiques by Lévi-Strauss, that he addresses his experience in Brazil. And he says, and both of them, even Roger Bastide, were very, very conscious and very keen on, as they used to say, trying to understand Brazil in its own terms, and understanding this society on its own terms. Roger Bastide often, they were very influential teachers at the university, yeah, and formed the first generation of Brazilian sociology professors. Roger Bastide has a revealing reflection on this issue. In a late interview he offered about his USP experience, which actually lasted from 1938 to 1954. He said that when he arrived in São Paulo, at the University of São Paulo, his aim was to extract from reality a Brazilian theory without imposing on Brazilian facts a sociology born in North America or in Europe. Not that one could not find afterwards a convergence, but one had to start from Brazilian realities. Yes? So with all from our standpoint, everything could be, my God, this is totally colonized, the guy is French and so on. But you have to imagine that there was no institutionalized sociology or social sciences in general in Brazil at that time, yes? And this kind of understanding that it could perhaps, it would be important to search for a situated knowledge about a country with strong colonial and slaveholding roots. And also, both of them were very impressed by the students who knew everything about France, about the French philosophers. They spoke actually French in their homes because it was an elite, yes? But they did not know anything about the neighborhoods they lived in the city of São Paulo. So this kind of reality is also part of the social sciences in the global South and has to be addressed too. We are seeing it here in this wonderful campus too. Indeed, this commitment to a search of a situated knowledge, no? And then this kind of rationale, of conception, this very strongly disseminated into the way the first Brazilian-born sociology professors at the University of São Paulo started to not only to teach but to do research, and this practice has reached me as a student of the University of São Paulo and in the 1990s and since then. So I would like to point out specifically the example of Florestan Fernandes, just very quickly, in order to show a bit what I'm trying to say here. This idea of decolonizing a decolonized way of doing research historically prior to the decolonization debate, but obviously with the tools he had. Né? And so actually in a certain way, perhaps this is a dialogue with your suggestion, Gabriel, of a dialogic approach to this kind of decolonizing debate. Yes. So the work of Florestan Fernandes, who was really, one has to say, as it were our Durkheim, our Emile Durkheim, due to his engagement in institutionalizing sociology as a scientific discipline among us in Brazil. Robert Merton, the North American functionalist sociologist, he explicitly referred to Florestan Fernandes in his book, Social Theory and Social Structure, as having authored one of the most important critical appraisals of the functional theory by 1968. His remarkable book, named Empirical Foundations of Sociological Explanation, but which unfortunately was never translated into English. But Robert Merton had access to it, to a kind of house-made translation of the book. So what I would like to just to point out here for this presentation, very briefly, are two epistemological traits of Florestan Fernandes' way of addressing addressing research, and translating this quest for let's try to understand the society on its own, in how to do this in methodological terms. He made a kind of distinction that for me has been very useful. It's obviously a kind of more on an epistemological level than in the methodology. Yeah, obviously also in the methodological level. But the most interesting thing in my case, and this is also an issue of dialogue with Nina, is the distinction he does between methods of interpretation, of investigation, or methods of operational methods and interpretive methods. So he says that research in sociology inevitably counts both on theoretically loaded methods of interpretation and operational methods of investigation. So methods of interpretation means how, for example, the theories we use at the end of the day, which is the methodological, which are the methodological implications of a theory, or of one of the theories we use in order to understand, to interpret the social world. This has to be distinguished from the methods we use to, for example, collect data, produce data about the empirical setting we do research on. This means the so-called methods of investigation. Yes, and so I would say that this is one important distinction. So obviously this means to be conscious that, for example, how much we actually owe to European or to global North theories and methods of interpretation about our own society when we do research in the global South. Yes, but to have this distinction in mind, to understand that, wow, it may be or how can we contribute to these theories, which are usually stem from the global South, or have been accomplished or developed amidst this dialogue between the North and the South. Yes, and a second important, in my opinion, an important trait of this kind of thinking that Florestan throughout his trajectory emphasized is that the importance of qualitative and, as it were, creative operational methods based on a quest for empirically strongly rooted methods of interpretation. So the importance, for example, to really search for how do we do research on, for example, if you have such a socially unequal country like Brazil, what did he decide to study, and he encouraged his students to study? To search for the, as it were, social margins, like study what was the presence, or how was the relationship between blacks and whites in slaveholding São Paulo. To focus on the blacks in a society in which the blacks were socially marginalized. Or, for example, one of his students, Gilda de Mello Souza, what was fashion in the 19th century Brazil? Can you talk about fashion in a slaveholding society? Or, for example, what Maria Isaura Pereira de Queiroz, who is one of also women our first women, very important women sociologists. She studied the presence of peasants amidst urbanization in Brazil, or in São Paulo very specifically, a city that changed a lot, that urbanized very quickly. And then what was the role, and how did peasants live and survive and get by and so on. Or for example, Roberto Cardoso de Oliveira, another student of him, indigenous peoples in class society. This was one of the terms they used of now. Or for example, the youth in Brazil in the 1960s. Yes. So what I'm trying to say is that, for example, this kind of emphasis on always this, who is at the margins, at the social margins of a specific research setting you are studying, this is a kind of, I would say, empirical object or empirical focus that has to do with this quest for, let's see, what is society, what is the city, what is Brazil from the point of view of those who are not at the center, who are not at the center of power and so on. But this is a whole, as it were, it presupposes an epistemological construction, which has to do with this quest for trying to understand Brazil on its own terms, and also, and that's why the role of ethnography, for example, ethnographic thinking in Brazil, in the social sciences, and also in Latin America in general, is so strong, because we see ethnography as a very, an important possibility of really bringing to the fore these other voices, yes, and in the production of a rooted, empirically grounded theoretical approaches has been on our focus. But obviously this means that we will never find in Brazil, not even Florestan Fernandes' work, we will not find, for example, theories, full-fledged theories, theoretical accounts like the ones we find in German sociology, for example, even in social theory, Pierre Bourdieu or Anthony Giddens in the UK, yes, or Talcott Parsons in the USA. It's always theory, that grounded theory, as it were, yes. I have to say that the last military dictatorship in Brazil, strongly, which was from 1964 to 1985, so 21 years, almost a generation, the dictatorship strongly harmed this tradition by establishing the compulsory retirement of professors like Florestan Fernandes and like his students. Florestan Fernandes was 50 years old when he was compulsory retired from the University of São Paulo. He had to he left the country and went to Canada because he was invited, and then also he went to Yale and then to Canada and stayed there for years. It was horrible for him, because he was very strongly committed to Brazil, and he himself came from, he was very poor. He came from, he has a very poor background. His mother was a servant in a house, a domestic servant. She was a single mother, and he spent from his 60-year-old to 60, from 10 years, from the 6 to his 60th year, age of 6 to 16 years old, he spent in the streets, as street vendor, as shoe shiner, and so on, without studying. He started studying when he was 16, and then he had this, and thanks to the University of São Paulo, because it is totally a free university, and that's how his career started. So for him, it was enormous suffering to be outside Brazil, and I'm only using this as a kind of example, really, for us to think whether we don't have more of these forerunners, with all the difficulties that obviously the debate from our standpoint had at that time. For example, Floresta Fernandes was someone who totally believed in modernization, for example. He said that if Brazil becomes a modern country, then we will have less social inequality and so on and so on. People will get rid of the griddles of the past and due to slavery and so on. Yes, but and now I come to my. I'll finish. No? Obviously, addressing the epistemological challenges I see in the present regarding this decolonization debate, if we take into consideration this kind of local pre-decolonization, decolonized reflections. Decolonization is nowadays a presupposition, so this is our quest and the quest for the social sciences. I think it has become really an important emphasis because it's really, I totally agree that this is important, even in our countries, because we also have in our global south to decolonize our way of looking at our and doing research. Yes, so what I'm saying is decolonization is a presupposition, so the positionality matters. Yes, another no-go is obviously the belief in a worldwide spread of Western modernity, which is something these guys totally believed in. So, in other words, the so-called methodological nationalism is a total no-go. These are things we know in sociology nowadays. No problem with that. Yes, but we also another important challenge for any kind of attempt, a local attempt, to think decolonially, being or addressing the global south and being in the global south, is to consider that we don't have a country like Brazil, Germany, and so on, which was this methodological nationalism as spaces of reference for the social sciences, but these global and local dynamics and the way they are experienced bodily in the everyday life, in whether urban, rural, forest loaded, and public, intimate, digital spaces. So we have nowadays it's become clear, or I could say it's my impression from the debates, is that we are sure that at the end of the day, we want to understand people in their everyday lives and the way they behave and so on, regardless of whether they are Brazilians, Botswanians, Germans, Americans, and whatever. Yes. And we also have to consider, this is something we know nowadays, and at that time it was not clear that they believed in this idea of modernization as a process, as a linear process and an evolutionary process. Yes. Nowadays we know that we have various times, or better stated, temporalities. So we have different temporalities. Social life is totally immersed in multiple temporalities. This is also an issue that Nina and I have been discussing a lot. The historicity of social processes alongside the now and then of situations of social interaction amidst the immensely long durée of the Anthropocene. So all of this is our situation now, and not to forget the importance of materiality, which is also something that did not exist in Floresta Fernandes sociology. The idea that you have to consider the way, the role of materiality, humans and non-humans interactions, and so all of this was not an issue for these guys. So what to do with this quest for a situated, rooted knowledge? My experience here at SMUS, and indeed inclusively the way I've been working on time and space in the framework of this center I'm coordinating in Brazil, a very young center for the studies and research in the sociology of space and time, is that one could perhaps, what I'm been trying to do is a kind of spatially and temporally rooted sociology. So a kind of exploring the social and relational dimension of space and time as methodological categories to, as it were, frame our the empirical objects we do research on. So actually, and trying to root the knowledge in spatial temporal time. So apart from nations or cities or neighborhoods, but really always trying to frame social action, interaction specifically in temporal spatial terms. This means exploring the plurality of spatialities and of temporalities in everyday life, and also the longue durée implicit in all of this. But this is one of the possible approaches. I've been working on that, but this is what I wanted to offer you here. And now I hand over to Nina. Is really how many forerunners of this kind of attempts actually to address our research setting in decolonized ways we had prior to this debate. Yes, thanks.
You can see, like we're talking all about positionality and how both what it means and how to handle it. And it's closely also linked to emotion, as you can see from our life stories. The other day in the methods courses, one of the persons in the audience asked me, how do you handle emotion in the research process? And I said, well, I handle it in a way that I try to reflect about why am I becoming emotional and what does this mean for my analytical ability. And when we're having this discourse, it already reveals like my own emotions. When I'm relating to the Latin American debates and what we're discussing with Brian, it is always regret. Regret because it's such a rich debate, which is very long, where so much could be learned from the Global South. But hardly any of the bodies of works are translated. And because my Spanish and Portuguese aren't good enough, I also cannot read the text to get the finities. When I started having debates with Gabriel, and he gave me access to some of his most favorite epistemological contribution in Africa, which also talked a lot about the way African university systems are working. Frankly, my first reaction was shock. I'm going to come back to that in a while and explaining why I was shocked. But I think sort of it revealed about a lot about which I think is important for the post-colonial debate. I was not shocked about, by the way, African scholars. I was shocked because I only realized how deeply, at least in Africa, some issues overrun, and I don't, and I think going in line with Gabriel's, we have to find a way of overcoming this. And the first thing, I think the start of the debate, and like coming slowly going back to my own positionality, if you're looking at the decolonial debates, especially contribution from African scholars, you always find an argument. The argument is built up against Eurocentrism, the West, and the global North, and this is the starting point of the argument. And if you're looking at it, what they're actually arguing are about Anglo-Saxon countries, usually about the US. I mean, note the US are not even in Europe, so you should. There is a centering of the global university system towards the US, but that's not in Europe, but also United Kingdom, but also countries like Ireland, Australia, and New Zealand with their own epistemologies. And also please note, I'm from continental Europe. There is a reason why why it was, of all countries, the UK that left the European Union, because on a cultural and epistemological level, there's a cultural difference. Also note that there is huge epistemological diversity within continental Europe. That's sort of That's sort of the first thing to note, that there is a lot of different countries. In a way, it is sort of arguing against epistemological diversity and summing it up in one ground. This is also maybe one of the reasons why a lot of scholars don't feel criticized. I mean, it's like some of the criticism, I say, yeah, okay, they're criticizing the US and UK. So what does this mean for my country? We do have issues, but there are in other areas. The second one is um, um, that is always missed is that actually the way colonization went, it wasn't the Europeans who colonized other countries. It was the elite, meaning the upper 1% and 2%. And historically, these were nobles, actually second son nobles who couldn't have a chance in Europe, which is why they went off. So nobles, the church elite, which were also nobles, basically unwanted sons who weren't supposed to produce legitimate heirs, and bourgeois Americans. And today these are capitalist elites. This is important because in European history, in our revolutions in the 19th, 20th century, in parallel to colonization, we got rid of, we tried to get rid of these elites, and most academics and everyday Germans are middle class. Sociology even has a large part of the population coming from the working classes, and and a lot of European discourse is also about getting rid of the same systems of thought. Also note this means that in large parts of the global south, even today, the elites you're meeting, this is not Europeans. This is a small elite. Most Europeans don't really travel. So there's sort of an argument against elites and a very specific group of persons that most of us would agree on. And then if you're looking at the history, if we go back in the history, and this relates also in a way to what in parallel to what Brian has described to Brazil, what happened in Europe, and maybe actually it even started in continental Europe a little earlier, is in this fight for getting rid of elite and power, a change of the university systems. So basically, in pre-industrial times, the universities were organized by the church as a means for church, like indoctrinating people. And so basically, creating knowledge at that time was replication of parroting of canonized knowledge and individual thoughts. And also knowledge was a sort of power for statistics and the public administrations in the fight of nationalism states against each other. This is important because in the 19th centuries, in our political relations, well, first of all, it's important because it's the colonial model of knowledge. What I see from the way, I haven't seen an African university from within, but what I read from the text and what we heard in the presentation, this is still this kind of model of knowledge, maybe even worse because it was combined with the military a need for administrators, so it was even enhanced. But what I saw, like for example, in reading in Texas, for example, by Francis Nyanyo, it's exactly what is how, like this old model of knowledge is still implemented in Africa. And then in the course of European epistemological research, there, at least in the way it went in Germany, I know that a lot of the philosophers in continental Europe are from Germany, and that usually most of the important thoughts get lost in translation in English. So you actually don't really understand what they have been saying if you don't read the original kernel. For example, a good example, which is why related to Francis Ngannou text, is like in Enlightenment and Immanuel countries, in a lot of texts, it's sort of the starting point of the argument against Western thought. Kant saying, habe Mut, dich deines Verstandes zu gebrauchen. And somehow, in being translated to English and transferred to Africa, they're saying something about that this is about the distinctions of the body and the mind, and about dominance and other. So, for example, it's in Texas by Walter Griffiths and Podolsky, we're reading this. And note that in English you have a distinction between body and spirit, but the German word Geist means both mind and spirit. And like a word like, for example, Geistreich means be heartfeltly, spiritually. So it has this idea that you cannot distinguish the mind and the spirit of a person. So coming back to Kant, actually, Immanuel Kant does not mean dominance. It means dare to think by yourself. So actually, when you're reading texts by the Fight for Epistemic Freedom, I, as a German from my own epistemic tradition, I would completely agree, and this is why I was shocked in saying, like, why are Africans not doing that? Because that's the foundation, not only of the social sciences, this is the foundation in Germany of the modern university system. This basic idea, how do we emancipate ourselves from models of control, of dominance of the state, the church, and capital, and dare to think by ourselves in creating knowledge? And now this is also most continental European university systems are built around this idea. Now, the idea of the Humboldt idea of learning is that learning has to be locally embedded. Centers of learning have to be equal status. Just like up to today in continental Europe, there is no hierarchy like in the local university system. We don't ask which was the best university. Is a good university changes over time depending on who does the good research. It's also this idea that research and teaching should be combined. While in other countries, like in the US system, you get exempted from teaching if you go on the career. We do the more teaching, the older we become, because we're supposed to learn from the students as the students are supposed to be learning from us. Students are supposed to be intellectual challenges by asking the right questions, make us thinking about canonized knowledge. And what I've heard from African university about the ideas about localizing knowledge, I don't see any differences between the way we are doing our teaching and what is proposed for African universities. It's also about training the next generation as a common task. And I would say continental European university. The second is a German thing resulting from epistemological traditions. Note that the founding moment, German sociology has two founding moments, 1837 and 1909. And there were actually two issues which are directly related to what we are doing the centers and to current issues. The first one, we call it soziale Frage, social question. At that time, Germany faced industrializing, urbanization, increase of poverty. We had working classes were involving struggles, and there was this issue about solving this issue. What do we do? Because like at that time, academia mostly looked at the leads. And the question was, how do we give answers to those societies, and how do we go about it? Note that probably, and up to today, asking these questions have been a key moment of the sociology and the social sciences. The second one, and this is important to the debate we're having now, is actually an epistemological critique, which is very, very difficult to translate. Gap or judgment? Value judgment debate, but it does not sound right. Basically, it both reflects in the way research was done and in the way in epistemologically. At that time, in the 19th century, there was positivism in the social science represented by Gustav Moller, basically arguing that all disciplines should be natural sciences, Naturwissenschaft, note also linguistically, it's Wissenschaft, it's not science, so academia, aiming at objectivity. But also note that is sort of implemented in statistics, in public administration statistics, with the claim that this was objective knowledge. Also note we do have this knowledge at the moment. People, when we're talking about big data and digital data, same claim. We have objective knowledge. But also note that the historical sciences and humanities at the time also claimed, at the same time, they claimed to be a constructivist. That was in the humanities, being more subjective. And there were two strands of it. The one stance giving any type of, giving up any idea of comparison, but this is why Gabriel is arguing against the relational approaches, basically arguing we take each culture similarly. Now, the 19th century debates, and especially Max Weber and Bernard Sombart were actually there. Basically what they argued, this is the basic problem about this is that we do know that positionality plays a role. This was already known in the 19th century. So it does make a difference who asks the questions how, because our positionality plays into it. However, the key problem is in the humanities. Maybe you can completely deconstruct, but if you don't make social research, it doesn't make any sense, because we're implying some kind of objective reality. And we still do want to say that, let's say, Brazil and Botswana have fewer resources and the average person is poorer than the average German. So we're making a claim of objectivity, but at the same time, we don't know how, we know that knowledge is locally based. So what do we do about it? The second claim, by the way, that social sciences also said, and this is sort of comparing the natural sciences and the humanities, is that that's, the problem about objectivity and power playing into the data creation. That was the second epistemological critique, that any public statistical data, special administrational data, are always arguing from a power position, because administrators will define the way science is done. But the same goes through for case studies, because every field, like in ethnography or historical case study, there is power relations. And if you just truthfully replicate what the field tells you, you will replicate the power structures of the field, whatever they are. Which is, by the way, what you will notice in the architects and the urban designers, that most sociologists and anthropologists aren't so happy about this idea about participant research, because we always think, yeah, but then what you do, how do you avoid replicating the field's power structures? And then Weber and Sombart basically argued for going a middle ground, and this relates to what Fire says, going for interpretativity, by the way, not only for qualitative research. This is not about qualitative or quantitative research, but also for quantitative research. And they marked this middle ground by saying, okay, the cultural and social sciences should place a middle ground. And we see the debate is easier to understand in Germany because all in Germany it's Naturwissenschaften, Geisteswissenschaften, and Kulturwissenschaften. So it's always Wissenschaften. In English, it's natural science, humanities. So it sounds like something different, but in Germany, the idea of a middle German language and middle ground is easier to understand. And also note, this is, you will see, especially German sociologists are very methodological and theoretical. Weber's argument was the social sciences should be also a complementary science, a science especially to historical science and humanities, but also to the natural sciences. And we're complementary by using theory and methods for reflecting how we're going to handle this. And you can see from Prior's debate, there has been a lot of working on how we're building theory and methods in order to better research. Also note, this reflects in my position. I'm at every German sociology department, you will find methods professors whose epistemological role is giving the methodological critique to everybody else, but also thinking about how are we going to solve these issues. And by the way, we have some solutions which improve the situation, but the basic problems are not yet resolved, which is one from our epistemological stance. We are really happy to have this discourse. Just seeing in the audience, like colleagues like Martin Weitbull as a representative of ISA RC33, or Wolfgang as a Asha as a representative of RN21, they're all happy because it might be a step forward for us for our blind spots that we know we have for getting ahead. So, but in order to have this debate, you have to realize that today we have a whole variety of epistemological schools which give very different answers of how to handle data in the field, how to build relations of theory, and note, most of it hasn't been properly translated to English. So you won't find it, won't find it in English language discourse. You'll find a lot in the Spanish, Portuguese, Latin American debate, very a lot in French and in German, in many other languages. So it hasn't been translated. The common ground of most of the modern schools is they strongly express reflexivity, self-reflexive, and the role of theory and methods. Theory has the role of improving reflexivity and self-reflection and formalizing, integrating it into academic debates. And methods it's not about specific cool techniques. Methods are about finding ways of creating knowledge as objective as possible. No, as possible. In European epistemologists, no one would ever claim that we're creating objective knowledge. This is so 19th century to us. We would say we try to get as close as possible that we can still make comparisons. It's about techniques of improving about finding reflexivity. So for example, these techniques, how do I handle my emotionality in the field that it doesn't get in the way of what I'm doing in research? That's what it's about. And about including epistemology and philosophy of science in the debate. Also note that to continental European epistemologists, research always has to be embedded in social context. It's not a matter of a debate. So even the idea, and this is coming back to the shock to me as a German methodologist, the idea that you would get from a book written in America, how to do research, let's say in Chicago, and use the same method in an African context, that's nonsense. How could that ever work? I wouldn't like, the way we would do it is like always, research has to be integrated in sociological everyday practice, and it's part of the early stage of training of the university, first university training, that we started, how do you embed research? It's part of the habitus of good sociologists to us. So, actually, the point is like, we completely everything has been said. So instead about talking about how we should do it, let's go about thinking about how we actually do that and learning from each other, because I'm seeing there's a lot of good ideas how we could do it. So coming back, everything Gabriel has said, I completely agree with, and I have to add, 3 points. I think actually when we're talking about decolonizing, we don't have to only address about different colonial perspectives, and this is hurtful probably for most of us. To be frank, most of us are from the upper middle classes or upper classes from the 1 or 2 top percent, if you're lucky, from the upper 10% of our own societies. This is enormously important for research because we have to first of all make sure that we don't do research on ourselves, but also our fields will react to that. It's like, this is something I realized when I was first in the field with Gabriel, with Gaurav in India. I always thought it is better if an Indian colleague goes into the field. And it was interesting because when I'm going to India, my major drawback is I cannot speak Hindu or any other local languages. But what happened actually when Gaurav was there, they didn't react to me as a person as a global north. They reacted to Gaurav's positionality, and interactions were actually earlier in action, although I couldn't speak the language, were always in the poor neighborhoods better than when he wasn't there, probably because they know that I'm oblivious to the social conflicts that play a long role in India. So, and then there's other things I cannot do. So maybe getting this idea from ethnography, working with insider and outsider positions and knowing that they're getting different types of knowledge, which might as a whole create better knowledge, might be ways of doing it. I also think about, we have to probably think about every single culture, how to address this and how to do research and how to handle our position as usually higher class persons doing that. Second one, and it's already come from my talk, we have to talk about language. This is not, by the way, only about reading texts. It is about reading texts because a lot of the thought work not only has been not translated, but also the concepts change. The translation issue maybe will relax when we're talking about the way translation machines go to, but the conceptual things means that I realized this first when I tried to learn Thai, and I realized a lot of things that are translated as concepts in Thai language mean a completely different thing, and I'm not even really sure if I understood them. But more importantly, English has become something as a mark of the elites. Now, the poor representative of our populations, they, in any country, they usually speak the native language. If you want to do social research in Germany, especially with the elderly and the poor and the young, you have to be fluent in German. It's not a one, what we can do on a weekend won't suffice. You have to be very refined fluently, which was one of the reasons why the center is so important to me. Because as I said, when I tried to learn to speak Thai, I realized I might reach basic Thai knowledge, but it will never be good enough to do field research. And we have to address how we're doing that. And from what I got in a lot of countries, scholars do research in English or French or any other colonial language, but then what kind of, who really gets access to what kind of knowledge are we doing it? And the third point, and this is really one of the reasons why to me the center is so important. If we're talking about decolonizing, I'm from the global north. I cannot provide the solutions. I can't ask things about my own society, which might make me a better researcher, but I cannot tell which way to go this. So for the solutions for these issues have to come from the global south. And we do believe that although it is a small start, the center will provide options and opportunities for developing these solutions. And I would want to invite the colleagues for, as the aim of this dialogue, starting to providing solutions and developing. I think we can only do better. So thanks a lot in the name of all of us, and thanks for listening. And okay.
Since
Thank you for a very interesting keynote address from all the three speakers. But I just wanted to add that we've got an experience from Botswana, Brazil, and Germany. We haven't really talked about the India experience, and that's something which I thought we should have included. And, from my past experience, looking at the paradigms you put on the screen, which is also very interesting, the Indian sociologist M.N. Srinivas, who, expounded on the concept of Sanskritization, I think he used all these, these methods. And I think he was able to sort of, to some extent overcome the decolonization, sort of, what should I say? Well, I mean, the background of that and expound these concepts. Don't you agree to that?
So I think with that, we come to the conclusion of this wonderful keynote by three stars sitting on the dais. May I request my SMUS team to also please join us on the stage, and may I now request Professor Manish and Professor Shubhajit to join us in felicitating the keynote speakers with a group photograph, and followed by then we move to respective destinations for the following sessions. So towards the end, duty to propose a vote of thanks to the three keynote speakers, Professor Praya, Professor Nina, Professor Gabriel, to the RC33 and the RN21 network, to the SMUS partners, the SMUS Team India, and also to the Government of India for ensuring that all the international people are here with us. Thank you so much, everyone, and see you in the various sessions. Starting now. So we are maybe starting 10 minutes late. I hope we see you at lunch. Thank you.